So I am in the process of swapping out the cartridge of my VF39 Turbo. I ordered a new one from XS Boost Turbochargers. Got it in the other day. And figured I'd make a short video on how to swap these out. This is going on a Subaru Forester XT VF39, like I said. Same thing for Subaru WRX or STI or pretty much any turbo Subaru application with a 2.5 or 2.0. Alright, let's get started. First and foremost, I'm going to take off these two bolts right here. These are the coolant lines. So go ahead and get started doing that. Now, if you'll notice, these banjo fittings have a small washer right here. Don't lose that, those are important. And also on the actual cartridge itself, you'll note that there is a, let's see if I can focus on the front one. There's another washer right here. And I'll have to see if I can pop that out because it feels like it's pretty well in there. So we'll have to see if we can get that out. Maybe pry that out real quick. Yeah. I got both of those washers off. I ended up using a pick similar to this one. Just put a little pressure on the side. They popped right out. You might want to make sure you have a clear workbench when you're doing this, because mine ended up flying off to the side and I had to go hunting for it. So right here we are with the turbo. Next thing I'm going to do is take out these two oil passage bolts. They look to be 10 mil. Now, part of the reason why I'm doing this next is because I'm going to take some measurements to ensure that I get the turbo clocked correctly before I go tearing apart the compressor housing and the turbine housing. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started on that. Pulled the oil return line off. There's a gasket on there. I highly recommend replacing that gasket. Don't bother trying to reuse it, just replace it. Now, as you see, I've got the turbo. I'm holding it down with my thumb, but the part where the up pipe bolts to the turbo is actually sitting flush with my tray here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a measurement on this oil fitting, which that oil fitting, it looks like it's pointing straight up at the 12 o'clock position. So that's going to be pretty easy to place. All I've got to do is hold this down flat again and make sure that the oil fitting is at the 12 o'clock position. And the oil fitting is probably not going to be that detrimental as far as reattaching it, because as we all know, the flex line, or the hard line that goes into the turbo, is actually somewhat pliable and bendable. The 3 points of interest for us are going to be the two bolt holes here, which will decide where the coolant passages lie, and obviously the it's not the inlet, but it's the intercooler side of the compressor. So we're going to take a measurement at the top of that bolt. We might actually correspond to a measurement at the bottom of one of those, just so we can make sure we get it right. And we're going to measure to the bottom inner diameter of that of the intercooler side of the compressor. Alright, now I'm fully well aware that this is not exact science, that my tray isn't completely 100% level, and that the turbo isn't completely 100% level, but the top of the calipers, in reference to the top of the oil fitting, looks to be fairly parallel. This is enough for me to say that this is probably pointing up at the 12 o'clock position. More importantly, I see that my coolant passage lines, they look like they're perpendicular. They're directly perpendicular to the oil line. So what I'll just need to do is make sure that the oil line's pointing straight up when I clock this back in, and that the coolant lines are pointing straight out toward the driver's side. So I'm going to go ahead and take a measurement of the other. Alright, since I've determined that my oil line is directly perpendicular at the 12 o'clock position, I have now placed my caliper inside the inside the inner diameter here. Now, as you can see, I've got the bottom laying flush on the pan, and I've got the inside of the caliper, let's see if I can focus on that, laying just inside the intercooler side of the compressor. So, what I'm going to do is I'm not even going to bother taking a measurement. I'm going to lock down that nut right there, and the next time I go to put this back on, I'll know that that's the right height. So let's go ahead and get to undoing the turbo. Next up on the agenda, I have taken the wastegate and I've pulled some bolts off of there, so now it can swing freely. Now what I'll end up doing is, as I swing this out of the way, what I'll end up doing is I'll take off the other remaining 8mm bolts down here at the bottom, and we'll end up sliding the compressor housing off. Alright, so actually, under a little bit more inspection, I found out that the compressor housing for this, I'll see if I can set this up to where you can see it. Sorry, not compressor, turbine housing. There we go. How's that for a nice crack? Keeping all that in mind, now we're going to take the compressor housing off and just kind of wiggle it out of the way and set it aside. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, as you can see, I got the compressor housing off, sitting right there. Now how I got that off is I actually took a hammer and very, very lightly tapped. Oh, set that aside. I tapped right here. Let's see if I can focus in on this a little bit more. Right here, right here, right here. So basically I went through and I went around it as best I could, and I focused on the really meaty parts of the cast aluminum. You don't ever want to try and hit it hard, especially hard, on something that's thin or right next to something that could bend or break, like right in here. So that's just how I did it. Some people probably have another way they did it, so forth and so on. But from there, this apparently is the only part that I am going to get to keep, because I did not know that the turbine housing had a giant crack in the back of it. I will be cleaning this up because that is just some nasty garbage right there. I don't know if you can see that. See if it'll focus on it. Yeah, it does a little better. But yeah, that's just some nasty garbage. Alright, now we're going to get the turbine housing off. We'll start taking it off by, let's see if I can get this to flip around, removing this bolt off the V-band and sliding this piece out that way. So, update. Old cartridge, old turbine housing. Remember let's see if it'll focus in here. Had a crack right there at the wastegate port. I don't know if it's focusing on it or not. I can't really see. It's not. Whatever. See if I can get it from this angle. Yep, right there. It's a small crack. I just got tired of dealing with fluttering wastegate valve and so forth and so. Oh, hey, I don't need to drop that. Anyways, so that being said, enter the new one, Kinugawa VF39 turbine housing. Doesn't have any exhaust studs. I've got some of those sitting over there right now. No cracks, freshly machined, and then that will go right alongside my XS Boost turbochargers cartridge. So we're going to get on putting the turbine side, which is this side. I'll slide this right in here like so and clock it correctly. And you remember we took some measurements with the calipers back here, so we'll see if we can line those up correctly. Now, I did notice that this has a small stud right there on the V-band, and if you look, there's a small pinhole right here at the bottom of the turbine side. So I'm going to guess that those two should line up. So let's go ahead and get them on. So I was having trouble lining up the turbine inside the housing, and I keep putting it on. I keep hearing this rubbing sound. I think is what it is this dust shield likes to just get slightly off-centered, catch, and then I shove it up on this, and I get this rubbing sound. Let's see if I can do it with one hand. You probably can't hear it. But I decided to prop this up. Again, please, if you're doing this yourself, do not use force. Force is bad. This should slide on, hopefully. But I'm going to try this method right here with it propped up. I'm going to line up the dust shield. I don't know if you can see it. Let's see if I can get it refocused on the dust shield. But, yeah. Line up the dust shield so that way it's not interfering anywhere. And then set the compressor housing down, or turbine housing down, on top of it. So what I've got here is I have it lined up. You can see there's a small gap. If I push down on the back side of the turbine housing, the gap kind of goes away. And it spins freely with no contact. So I'm going to try and put the V-band clamp on there and see how it sets up. So that did actually work. I set it down on there nice and straight. I turned the radio off so maybe you can hear this. No metal-to-metal contact sounds spinning the turbine. I also had to make sure that the compressor wheel was spinning freely under here. It was hitting some of the wood earlier. But 10mm ratchet, or 10mm socket on a ratchet. Tighten this down. I'm sure there's a torque spec for this, but I don't know it. Subaru probably wouldn't even let you know what it was because they like to sell the entire unit as one part, and it's very expensive. So far, given this compressor housing, we're going to inspect right around this V-band real quick. Given the turbine housing and the cartridge, and the billet wheel. The cartridge was $375 shipped. The billet wheel was $100 extra, so $475. And the turbine housing was $207 off eBay. Now the seller on eBay claimed he had 5 in stock. Apparently he didn't, so he had to get it shipped directly from wherever they manufacture it. But all said and done, I'm looking at $675 in an effectively brand new VF39 with a billet wheel. So hopefully this will actually work out quite well for me. Now, next step. As you can see, the downpipe area has absolutely no studs. So we've got to go pick some up. I ended up getting these. Help 03400. Just exhaust manifold head stud kit. I got this at O'Reilly's, like $5 or $6. Is it going to focus? Reposition my hand, maybe I can get it to focus. But as you can see, they're M10 by 1.25. It comes with 3 studs, 2 bolts, 3 nuts. So what we're going to do is we're going to thread them in there finger tight. Now, I'm going to actually tighten these down as best I can right now. But at the end of the day, once I throw a nut on these and torque them down that way, it'll be torqued down plenty fine. In theory, I can just finger tight these and then hit it with a torque wrench, or hit it with a wrench later when I throw the downpipe on, and call it a day. Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about the length. Let's see if I can pull out the length on the back of the box. And that one's a little hard to run in. It's okay. Don't fall over. Length is, the studs are 40mm. And that should be more than enough to clear the downpipe and give me some room to work. So, up next, we're going to do the compressor housing. Actually, no, I take that back. I'm going to torque these down. Let me go ahead and get set up for that. Or you can see I've got just a tiny thin bead. A little bit of this stuff goes a long ways, guys. Focus. There you go. Now, the awesome thing about this is we still have this set up from when we took the measurement from the inlet. And we also have the wastegate, as specific bolt holes, that is only supposed to line up kind of in one direction. Yeah, there's going to be a little bit of play, but for all intents and purposes, it's going to line up in one direction. So that should help us in clocking the compressor side. So this is probably not going to be in focus. Let me see if I can. All right. So where we are now is I put 3 of the 6 bolts in place with just enough tension on it to where I can rotate this around, but it won't fall off. What I've done here is, remember the caliper we set up to be the specific height. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find a wrench, I'm going to raise it up to that height, I'm going to torque down on one of the bolts, applying just enough clamp force so that it'll stay in place and I'll be able to get the rest of the bolts torqued down. And that should complete the turbo swap. Alright, so I got it all back on. I've got the coolant rail set in place. I did notice one thing. The dust shield is making a little bit of noise. I've double and triple checked it. It's on there right. So I don't know what else to do other than just throw it on the car. I spun it up with air compressor. Didn't hear any metal on metal. I can spin it freely. No metal on metal. So yeah, just let it ride, I guess. Alright, to put this back on, I double checked my old videos. This is exactly how it goes. I did go ahead and buy new copper washers from the Subaru dealership for the banjo bolts that go right here. I only bought them for the space right where my finger is. I don't anticipate there being a lot of need for the one right here, plus it's already pretty well seated, so I didn't want to mess with it. That is the part number for the copper gasket. I know it says gasket oil turbo, but the guy at the shop looked them up, and they are the exact same. Do a side-by-side comparison of the old one versus the new one. So, there you go. That being said, I've got 2 of them, one for each side. Oh, wait, sorry. That is the part number for the copper ring. This is the part number for the gasket that goes down to the oil return tube. We'll be putting that over here with the oil return tube itself. We'll put that on later. And also, I noticed that my oil return tube had started to get very, very hard. Very, very hard. And brittle. So I figured, you know, eventually it's probably going to break. Now I know most everybody's probably going to say you could have just went to AutoZone or something and bought a generic hose and ran that, which is probably true, but I opted to do with Subaru OEM. So got a new hose right there. Go ahead and get all that stuff put on. Okay, well, unfortunately, the new Kenyugawa turbine housing had some issues, and I couldn't get it to seat down properly on the cartridge, which, if you remember earlier, I showed you that there was a little dust shield between the turbine and the cartridge itself, and that dust shield is actually captured by the housing. Now, apparently, something was machined incorrectly on the Kenyugawa housing, to the point where there was just a slight tiny gap. I mean, we're talking just tiny gap, where the dust shield would actually shake back and forth, and I could hear it when I picked the turbo up and just shook it up and down. Now, the reason why this is a bad thing is because eventually that dust shield would have rested down on top of the turbine wheel, and the turbine wheel would have rubbed and rubbed and rubbed until it either got A, out of balance, or B, it would have machined through it and broken off mid-pull somewhere. At which point, the whole thing just goes to pot and she's gone, Jim. So what I've done is I'm going to contact the eBay seller that sent me the housing, probably request a refund for my money, because I'm going to go ahead and reuse the old turbine housing. As you can see, it's got a little hairline crack right there. I've been told that's incredibly common, very, very common amongst all VF39s, and eventually all of them will have it. It's, I guess, a flaw in their casting, something to that effect. But that being said, I'm going to run the old turbine housing and just see how that works out. Now, for the fun part. This is the cartridge that came off the car. It started making a little bit of noise, a little bit of whining, and I didn't really realize the extent of how poorly this thing had been running all these years. Apparently, right after I got the Forester, I bought this turbo, and it was somewhat of a mystery as to its overall condition. I knew it didn't have shaft play. I knew it was from a fairly low mile car, but as you can see, this car was not performing at peak operation for quite some time. Now, let me start this by saying that I've never heard anything go through the exhaust. I've never heard or had a catastrophic failure of the motor. So, seeing this for the first time now makes me think that this came off a car that blew something pretty freaking hard. That being said, I will be checking my catalytic converter and the exhaust downstream just to make sure I don't find any of these pieces of metal. All that being said, I'm going to reinstall the V-band clamp right here. It will go right there, right around this connection. See if we get a better shot. I'll wrench down on that, prime the turbo, and stick it on the car and see how everything goes. Of course, I'm going to spin it just to make sure I don't hear any rubbing sounds or hear any rattling sounds. These are all issues that you absolutely do not want to experience. That being said, hopefully I'll see a fairly significant performance gain and get my car back on the road, because it's been down about a month. Alright, I guess that ends the video series. Thanks, and have a nice day.